Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Penn Nursing Innovation Colloquium, an introduction to design justice, community-led reflections from the Philadelphia Node. I'm Marion Leary, the Director of Innovation at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing. I am so honored to be joined today by our panelists from the Design Justice Philly Node. Maggie Delano, Assistant Professor of Engineering at Swarthmore College. Ila Kumar, a graduate student at the Affective Computing Group at MIT Media Lab. Sara Montijo, strategy consultant, and Andrea Ngan, co-founder and organizer of Creative Resilience Collective. Thank you all for being here. We're going to spend the next 60 minutes or so hearing from the Design Justice Network Philly Node members, discussing the history of Design Justice Network, the principles of design justice, and how they're using those in their work. For those who may not be aware, the Design Justice Network is a home for people who are committed to embodying and practicing the Design Justice Network principles and to bring forth worlds that are safer, more just, more accessible, and more sustainable. For the audience, if you have any questions during this presentation, please enter them into the chat and I will ask as many as I can. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Maggie, who will begin introductions, and then the group will discuss the principles of design justice and give us an overview of the local food. Maggie?
Great. First of all, thank you, Marion, very much for inviting us and for the introduction. I just wanted to start by talking about how we want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded land of the Lenni Lenape people in the Delaware Nations. And with that, I'm going to get into introductions. So I'll introduce myself first. So as Marion said, I'm Maggie Delano, Assistant Professor of Engineering at Swarthmore College, so just outside the city. I use she or they pronouns. I have short brown hair. And my role in the Design Justice Philly Node has been running our local book club and attending lots of meetings. I first came to Design Justice Node through reading a book about design justice that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And looking forward to talking with you all today. And I'll turn it over to Ila.
Hi, I'm Ila. I use she or they pronouns. I have dark black hair, and short hair with dark round glasses, and I have light brown skin, and I'm sitting in an office. I'm currently a graduate student in the Affective Computing Group at MIT Media Lab, and I came to Design Justice Network 2 or so years ago because it was the first place where I really felt like there was a way for my professional practice to line up with my personal values. And I'll pass it over to Sara.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. My name is Sara Montijo, she, her pronouns. I'm a brown woman in my 30s. I've got long, dark, wavy hair, round metal glasses. I'm wearing a green shirt and a dark gray sweater, and I'm sitting in front of a blue wall. I have a background facilitating multimedia programming and in communication. I became a Design Justice Node member in 2020. Andrea.
Hi, I'm Andrea Ngan. I use she, her pronouns. I am wearing a blue sweater with round gold glasses on and long black hair in my office space. There's some books behind me. I come to Design Justice as a design strategist and a community organizer. I helped co-found and initiate Creative Resilience Collective, a health justice organization in Philly. And I'm also a team member at the Service Design Studio with the City of Philadelphia. And came to Design Justice, came to Philly with these principles largely because a friend shared them with me in early 2017. And that's also to say that the Design Justice Network is made up of a lot of folks from all across the world. And we are just 4 members from the Philly Node kind of showing up today to share some of our lessons learned and sort of case examples from how we're trying to live and practice and embody these principles. And so with that, take us over to the introduction. So I'll pass it to Ila.
Awesome. So before we dive into some personal reflections, we want to start with an introduction of what the Design Justice Network is. And as Andrea mentioned, this is with the caveat that we don't represent the entire network, and we encourage those who are interested to learn more, and we'll share some ways to do that at the end. So the Design Justice Network emerged from a future design lab practice space at the Allied Media Conference in 2014. And it's since grown into a network of people who are committed to embodying and practicing the Design Justice Network principles. And I'll pass it over to Sara to talk about the principles.
Great. So yes, like Ila said, work developing these design justice principles began in 2014 at that Allied Media Conference in Detroit. And the hope was to start shaping a definition of design justice as distinguished from design for social impact or design for good, which are well-intentioned, but because they're not driven by principles of justice, can serve to harm, exclude, and perpetuate systems and structures that give rise to the need for design interventions in the first place. So after those 4 years, these are the principles that emerged. 1, we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. We center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. 3, we prioritize design's impact on the community over the intentions of the designer. 4, we view change as emergent from an accountable, accessible, and collaborative process, rather than as a point at the end of a process. Principle 5, we see the role of the designer as a facilitator rather than an expert. 6, we believe that everyone is an expert based on their own lived experience, and that we all have unique and brilliant contributions to bring to a design process. Principle 7, we share design knowledge and tools with our communities. 8, we work towards sustainable, community-led and controlled outcomes. Principle 9, we work towards non-exploitative solutions that reconnect us to the earth and to each other. Before seeking new design solutions, we look for what is already working at the community level. We honor and uplift traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge and practices. That, I'll pass it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Sara. So, these principles are really foundational for the network in the sense that they guide us in our work. And part of finalizing these principles after 4 years of working through them at Allied Media Conference, the Design Justice Network steering committee members began to establish a network structure. And so 2 of those steering committee members, Sasha Costanza-Chalk and Yuna Lee, after forming sort of the structure, began to seed a call for local nodes. And so in late 2018, Kristen George and myself were brought together by an email from Sasha and Yuna to establish a Philly node. And we kicked off the first Philly node gathering with a presentation from another steering committee member, Denise Shante Brown at Slot Foundation in West Philadelphia, and have been organizing book clubs, monthly node meetups, and emerging programs ever since. And we'll give you all a preview of how to get involved in that if you're looking to be part of this community later on in this presentation. But before we get into that, while the Philly node is fairly young in its organizing, we as design justice practitioners have been guided by these principles for quite some time, and our paths to practicing and embodying these principles are quite unique. And so we're here to just share some examples around how we've tried to bring these principles to life, and really how design justice shows up in our work and in our practice, but also, why we believe design justice is important in healthcare. And so with that, I'll pass it to Ila for this first case example.
Thanks, Andrea. So I'll be sharing an example of a recent situation where I tried to center design justice principles. This is a project I worked on with Tara Thorn-Bunyamanong, who's a game design and VR student at Drexel University. We designed this mobile application in response to passengers with we designed a mobile application that provides passengers with real-time transit alerts. We did this in response to a competition that was held by the city that asked for augmented reality tools that could help make SEPTA easier to use for people with disabilities. So during the process, we really wanted to prioritize Principle 2, centering the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. However, we were working with a really tight timeline. We only had a couple weeks to flesh out a pitch and then around 2 months to design and build a demo. The budget was also really small and only available after we had fleshed out a concept. So we navigated this in a couple ways. Before we started brainstorming any ideas, we did a lot of background research. We felt this was really important because we knew we didn't have the time or resources to start with user research. And also importantly, because we felt that it wasn't useful to ask community members information that we could find ourselves. It would be a burden on them that we didn't want to put on. So we made a point of not just looking at academic research, we also looked at news and narrative pieces because we felt like this would include more voices that are traditionally left out of academia. Then we, in the prototyping phase, we also prioritized user research over development. We spent most of our time and money on getting feedback from community members and iterating on the design. This meant that by the end, we didn't have a functional app, but we felt more confident about the usability of the design. We also wanted to center Principle 3, prioritizing the design's impact on the community over the intentions of the designer. We wanted to make sure that what we proposed was actually useful to people and it didn't just look like something cool that was in reality hard to maintain or keep error-free. This felt especially important because we were proposing technology that would help people gain information they didn't already have easy access to. So they might not be able to verify what the app was telling them in another way if there was any sort of bug or error. Another major challenge was the limitations of augmented reality technology. So AR technology, if you don't already know, combines virtual information with the real world. And some well-known examples are things like Pokemon Go and Google Glasses. You'll see that most of this technology requires you to be able to see and or hear and move around in your environment. So we were faced with the question of how we could design AR technology to be accessible regardless of one's vision, hearing, or mobility. And we felt that there was no way to do this with just one design. All design decisions prioritize someone. So we decided to prioritize customizability so the app could be adjusted to meet different people's needs. This meant both customizable notification types and frequencies, but also ensuring that for every AR feature, there was an alternative way of reaching the same goal. In the case of scannable QR codes, we actually made it the manual entry option easier to access than the QR code option because we felt like making the app easier to use for people with vision and mobility impairments was more needed than the ease of use that QR codes could afford. So in the end, this meant that we took a risk and pitched a simple application that utilizes augmented reality in a non-essential way because we felt like that would be most useful. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Maggie to share some additional reflections.
Thank you, Ila. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the experiences I've had as someone who works in engineering design and particularly on medical devices, which I think might be relevant to this crowd. So I'll talk a little bit for each of these examples about what this example taught me about design and also how design justice has influenced my design practice through each of these examples. So the first one I wanted to talk about is this heart monitor on the left side here. So when I started my master's was in 2010. At the time, there were not very many small electrocardiogram monitoring systems available where they might be today. And so people in my research group had basically built this flexible PCB that you can see the L-shaped thing in the middle there that they were trying to develop in order to create a way to monitor people in ambulatory environments so they could take it home and test for things like arrhythmias. And so one of the things that they discovered very early on in testing the device was that despite good intentions, the device was not able to be used by anyone with breasts or large pectoral muscles. So yet, even though I hadn't heard of design justice this time, I kind of said, well, we need to think about the actual impact of this design, which is that it cannot be used. And so my master's thesis was then to redesign this system, which we'll look up the system on the right side here. So basically what I did was, instead of having one unit that makes that L shape, I actually basically divided all of the electronics into these 3 different sections that then we could basically control how far apart everything was, and then place the center part like below the person's sternum, so that way it could be worn by more different kinds of people. So the kind of big design lesson that I learned from this experience was that engineers often unintentionally exclude people, and especially people coming from our engineering background, which was our background was in circuit design. It wasn't even in medical devices at all or anything related to human factors. So people don't really have this training, but they're wind up building things for humans, so they need to really get that training. And so this kind of set me off on this track of wanting to be more interested in engineering design. This was way before design justice, but it sort of set the tone for how I wanted to change my practice in order to build more inclusive devices. So we can go to the next project. Yeah. So then several years later, I was just talking with my partner, who's a non-binary person, and they wanted to use this weight scale. So at first you may think, well, there's not really much to these smart weight scales, but my partner said, oh, I would like to try this weight scale you have. I said, okay, sure. And so then we pulled up the app, and then I said, oh, this is interesting. There's 2 gender options. There's a male option, or there's like a pants option or a skirt option. So we assume that maybe that's male, female, or man, woman. But my partner, who's non-binary, was like, well, we don't know which one they should pick. And so they were like, well, just pick a random one. And so I just picked one, and they stepped on the scale. And then we're like, oh, that's surprising. Like, that body fat percentage doesn't really match with what we would expect based on their presentation. And so that kind of sent us down this rabbit hole of trying to understand why this scale was asking for gender. And kind of what we learned was that in design, there are actually often issues with software, in addition to the issues that I had learned firsthand with hardware previously, where these devices are asking for gender, but they're not really explaining how that's actually being used. And so when I did a lot of digging, basically what we learned was that they were basically saying that men have higher muscle mass on average than women. And so they were trying to use that to calibrate their algorithms. So it was really interesting because we kind of identified that there was this design assumption that was being made, and it was really unclear what someone who's non-binary should actually use, enter. And it depends on their physiology and lots of other factors. And when we tried to look into this further, we actually found that we couldn't even get access to the algorithm that the Withing scale uses. So we sort of learned that software has these embedded assumptions in them, but you can't even necessarily evaluate their impact because you don't actually know what the underlying algorithm is. And this has big implications for transgender people, intersex people, anyone who kind of doesn't fit the average, which is actually almost everyone in some cases. And there's also information it doesn't even measure, like race or ethnicity. And there's some mixed evidence that things like ethnicity might influence the way people's bodies are shaped. So this really opened my eyes to the idea that it's not just hardware, it's also software. And as we were doing this project, since I had already become a little bit familiar with the Design Justice Network, when we wrote up a paper about this, we decided to really focus on emphasizing my partner's experience using the scale and really do a more ethnographic approach, like talking about it as a story and not just about technical equations. And I think that was really helpful to talk about what the impact of this could be on a person using the device. Okay, and so the last thing I want to talk about is Apple AirTags project that I've been working on. And so one of the challenges with the weight scale, as I talked about, was that because we don't have access to these equations or the time to do a detailed analysis, we didn't really know exactly what the impact might be. It was kind of like we saw the tip of the iceberg, but we didn't really know how deep it went. But Apple AirTags are actually a different circumstance in that we actually do know that these have had a really big and actually negative impact, even in the short few months that they've been available. So if you don't know about the Apple AirTags, they're basically these small Bluetooth-enabled devices that can be, on your keychain or strapped to a dog or your kid. And the technology is really powerful because it leverages Apple's Find My network, which basically every Apple device is automatically linked into. And so although it was basically intended to help people track their property or their dogs, in the end, it is a very, very effective device for stalking and also for property theft. And so when Apple released these devices, they basically didn't think about like the potential worst case that could happen from using these devices. And now they're kind of frantically trying to put the genie back in the bottle and design to prevent misuse. And so the big design lesson I took away from this was that engineers at really big companies need training, just like the researchers did in my first master's project, is that they have this huge impact, but that they're really not centering marginalized voices. And the marginalized people are the ones who are paying the price for when things are wrong. So most people, or many people, are using these devices just, to find their wallet when they lose it. But then the people who are being stalked are the ones who are really having the negative experience. And if you don't design from the beginning, it's really hard to design for it after the fact. And so my work with the Design Justice Network really encouraged me to not just work on this from a technical point of view, but also try to reach out to organizations that have been doing research and advocacy and support for people who are victims and survivors of tech abuse. And so I have been spending a lot more time trying to talk with them about what they've been doing to try to prevent stalking, and also what other kinds of devices might be used for this purpose, and then trying to think about how we might be able to build a network of people, both technologists and advocates, in order to create a safer environment for everyone. And this will only become more important as our world becomes more connected. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Sara.
Thanks so much for that, Maggie. So I'm going to be sharing today a project I worked on in 2017, counter-marketing sugary beverages with middle schoolers in the Bronx. The impetus for this project is that marketing from big soda companies is disproportionately high in marginalized, low-income communities, and they tend to have more availability of sugary beverages. So young people are often unaware of how sugar impacts their bodies. But in the Bronx and other comparable neighborhoods throughout the country, people experience higher rates of things like diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, heart disease, and other issues related to excessive sugar intake. Endorsements from trusted, admired, and relatable celebrities is one common marketing tactic. You can see Drake and Beyonce in these two images. Can we go to the next? Thank you. So the challenge here is to address what's behind the marketing in alignment with the first Design Justice Network principle, which is we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. So counter-marketing art programs like the one I led in partnership with Creative Artworks, the New York City Department of Health, and MS-45 to develop multimedia curricula informed middle schoolers of the consequences of excessive sugar intake, while also empowering them with professional production tools, things like Photoshop, InDesign, Premiere, to make posters and PSAs that would inspire community-wide behavior change. The entire curricula was structured in alignment with the 10th Design Justice Network principle, which is we see the role of the designer as a facilitator rather than an expert. So we would invite students to pay attention to their environment. For instance, asking them to tune into their bodies after they drink a sugary drink. So do they feel calm and focused, or are they easily distracted? We would invite them to have a conversation with a grandparent who drinks soda regularly, or an elder with diabetes. And then we would watch commercials like Pepsi's Live for Now featuring Beyonce. And we'd look at it with a more discerning mind, asking questions like, does soda actually make you more attractive and courageous like the ad suggests? So the main goal of a program like this is to spark curiosity about the stories and the products that we consume, and to engage young people as agents who have the power to shape the world. With that, I'll send it over to Andrea.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And, I'm here to share a little bit about how the Design Justice Network principles led me to start the collective that I had mentioned in my introduction. And so some of the photos that you are seeing cycling through are examples of some work we've done here in Philadelphia. And so my design justice story begins with a friend sharing the principles with me in early 2017. And shortly thereafter, me making a really big transition, just trying to embody and practice this first principle that Sarah just mentioned. We use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. Trying to embody this and practice this while freelancing for, shopping platforms and marketing companies in the Bay Area was really challenging at this moment in time. And so I made a big shift, and the social and political urgencies post-2016 elections and these principles really helped me to find Creative Resilience Collective and a cohort of folks who were interested in designing for justice and liberation. And so thanks to the support of SLOT, a local arts and culture organization based here in West Philadelphia, there was a pathway for me to relocate and bring this sort of collective to Philadelphia. And with Philadelphia-based collaborators, we were really guided by the second principle to center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcome of the design process. And it was really with my co-founders in Philly, Bennett Kuhn and Jessa Lingle, who helped organize sort of the first collective study and research that we did in community to just listen to what folks needed and what we were uniquely suited to sort of address with our organizing and our efforts. And so based on our research findings and our collective sort of lived experiences, we decided to focus on working with underserved communities and advocates looking to combat stigma and improve access to self-determined mental health care in Philadelphia. And since late 2017, we've had many different initiatives, including participatory research projects, youth programs, community engagement efforts, socially engaged art installations, and panel discussions about harm reduction. And a lot of these initiatives have their roots in DJN, design justice principles. And so one of the projects I'd love to focus in on is creative resilient youth. Part of our collective listening in Philly led us to identify these gaps in mental health education and care for young people in Philadelphia. I also have a background in developing youth programming and working with youth. 4 of my other co-organizers, Felicia Blow, Bennett Kuhn, and Michelle Lee Delgado, shared this interest and passion. And so we proposed a short 8-session program to hold space for young people in Philadelphia in 2018 to make art and learn about mental health. It was a labor of love. We really created this space with very little funding and just a vision of what we would have wanted a space to look like for us when we were young, and moving through sort of the challenges of learning how to become an adult or find your agency. And so the sessions quickly came and went too quickly for our young people and even for us. And so our first cohort came to us with a much larger vision for CRY. And this was when we really lived into and embraced this principle around believing that everyone is an expert based on their own lived experience, and that everyone has a unique and brilliant contribution to bring to a design process. And we opened up the design process and have continued to do that in the CRY program. And so young people had a vision for a space to be held for them weekly for peer support and check-ins. They wanted a celebratory platform to exhibit and talk about what they learned and their vision for mental health care for themselves, each other, and their community. And so we come together late May, early June every year to kind of put together something in their vision. And I think a really big piece of our efforts is just to let youth lead and let youth be heard. So, CRY Youth have in the past produced, this annual exhibit, town halls, panel discussions about mental health, podcasts of which you can find on YouTube about, topics like drug use and SSRIs. They've facilitated letter writing and art making activities. They've spoken up at actions, at vigils, and created mutual aid and care funds to distribute resources to young people in need. And we're in our 4th year of CRY, and we're working with a cohort of 12 young people for the next 2 years to really realize youth-led models of care through co-learning, socially engaged art, and leadership training. And CRY envisions a future where every young person has the healing resources and skills they need to care for themselves, to influence how mental health is talked about and cared for in their peer group, families and communities, and other youth serving spaces, and also to have the resources to create tools to address injustices in youth mental health care. And so CRY, like CRC or Creative Resilience Collective, are just 2 examples of health justice spaces that are testaments to how design justice network principles can be, actionable and embodied, and they have guided me personally in the decisions I've made in, designing in these different spaces and working towards tools that sustain, heal, and empower our communities. And so, you can find the output of our work on creativeresco.org, of which I can drop a link, and also follow CRY and their efforts at cry.collective on Instagram. Before I drop those links, I also just wanted to share how you could get more information or get involved in the Design Justice Network and the Philly Node. And so with that, if you want to learn more about design justice, there are many free resources online. You can find zines about design justice network principles, emerging practices, how to apply these principles, how to start a node, all on the designjustice.org/zine website. You can also find more resources in the form of videos on DJN YouTube channel, and also Sasha Costanza-Chalk, one of the steering committee members, in 2020 had written a foundational book called Design Justice, Community-Led Practices to Build the Worlds We Need. And so I can share all those free resources in the chat, but we'll pass it to Sara to talk about how you can get involved.
Thanks, Andrea. So as a Philly Node, we meet virtually each month to talk about upcoming opportunities, to practice the DJN principles and check in with one another. When it's been safe to do so, we've also met in person. We might even be tending a garden together in the near future, really exciting. And soon we'll be rolling out a Skillshare where Philly Node members will have a chance to learn from one another. We also have a book club. And so I actually arrived at the DJN Philly Node book club as a resident of Atlanta, Georgia, back in October 2020. And now I live in Philly because this community of people is just that wonderful. So please join us. You can find out what we're up to on designjustice.org/events, and we really hope you do. We'd love to see you. Huge thank you for having us.
All right, well, thank you all for sharing your work and experience. It was really very helpful and enlightening. And I'm looking forward to joining the Philly Node hopefully soon. So I have so many questions for you all, and we have a minute or so left. If anybody of the attendees has any questions, please, again, feel free to throw them in the chat. But I will kick us off. So you all mentioned this a bit, but can you talk a little bit more about what it was about design justice that resonated with you? I first learned about design justice through Sasha's book, and for me, it really changed the way that I teach and I work, and really the way that I live and sort of just look at everything. Was it the same for you? What was it that drew you to design justice? Whoever won, jump ball, whomever would like to go first.
I guess I can say that I think I agree with you, Marion. I think so for me, in 2010, I had this first experience with redesigning the heart monitor, and I really changed course after that. I decided to take classes in women's and gender studies, and one of the challenges for me was that I felt like kind of a weirdo trying to bring up these things with my colleagues who were very technical focused and really didn't get it. It wasn't that they were being mean, they just really didn't see the value or the importance. And so I kind of had developed some of my own theories and ideas, and I was trying to read and I was trying to find people who might have some things in common. And then when I was getting ready to teach an inclusive design class that I taught in fall 2020. And so over the summer, I was like, let me read some books to try to prepare it. And that was right when the Design Justice book came out. And I read this and I was like, this is basically the textbook for my class. We read a lot of the different chapters in there, and there was some stuff that resonated with me that I had already experienced. And there were also things that introduced me to new ideas or challenged some of my existing ideas. So it was really impactful for me. And then also actually meeting all these fine people here. It's really only gotten more deep from there.
Yeah, I can share. Oh, no, go for it, Ed.
Oh, go ahead, Ila.
I was gonna say, I think for me, I learned about design justice as I was figuring out how to enter the field of design, and I was feeling disillusioned with kind of having tried it and felt like what I created didn't have any impact, and kind of trying to navigate how to create change through either design or through I was looking at academia, things like clinical psychology or social work, and I felt like design justice, the principles were a way to tie that all together without having to stick firmly in one camp. You'll see that a lot of people in the network are social workers. They are, some of them are classically trained designers. Some of them are group meeting facilitators. So I think for me, that really made me feel like I had a community, and that I wasn't kind of an imposter trying to do a bunch of things that I wasn't super knowledgeable about.
Yeah.
Would anybody else like to? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think I echo a lot of what Maggie and Ila are saying, and we all have also connected about this a great deal, in our monthly meetings and in book club conversations. But for me, coming from I wasn't trained. I didn't go to school for design. I was trained in industry, right? And I think oftentimes when we're working in these institutional spaces or in these corporate spaces, the conditions for equity or even for you to feel authentically yourself are just not, they might not exist because you're the reason for the institution or corporation, right? The sort of bottom line for a lot of these places is misaligned with what keeps people well, right? And so I think being in the Bay Area at the time when I was making this big transition and kind of moving out of that space and trying to find my people and sort of a place and the conditions for equity and justice and liberation, that was what the principles sort of set me off on that journey, because it was it isn't prescriptive. They're very open-ended. You're left kind of with all these questions after reading them. And I think that's what drew me to the network. It was like, okay, there are these people who have set sort of a vision through these principles, and now I'm asking how and where, and you know, in that journey, like there's a lot of unlearning and a lot of learning to do. And I think the network holds that space for all the folks like on those different paths, and gives a lot of grace and shares a lot of resources. And so I think that's what's kind of drawn me to this practice, and then also kept me there and sustained me through moments that I felt, you know, hopelessness or whatever it might be or overwhelm, because there's just so much work to do. But I don't know, Sarah, if you have, if you wanted to share.
I appreciate that. Everything that has been said, I feel like really resonates with me. And, you know, I shared my story of kind of attending the book club and finding community through that. It was Arturo Escobar's book called Designs for the Pluriverse, which inspired the subtitle of Sasha's book. And the sort of takeaway for that is a world where many worlds fit. So for me, design justice really is that home where all of these worlds can coexist and we can collaborate. And, you know, doing multimedia facilitation with youth and adults, and it's all about storytelling and healing that can happen as a result of the stories we tell. So it's really just been a space to invest in that and to be in community with that. I appreciate the question, Marion.
So I'm going to mention, we do a lot around human-centered design and design thinking at Penn Nursing. We're really trying to make that a foundation of the nurse-led health and healthcare innovation work that we do. I wonder how you see design justice either different from, say, human-centered design, or even equity-centered design, or community-based participatory projects. Is it different? Is it complementary? How do you see those fitting together? Again, whoever would like to go first.
Yeah, I can start, and then, you know, folks feel free to jump in. You know, there's so many buzzy terms out there. And I've found that, you know, through my journey, while I don't, you know, I really embrace and hold deep respect for equity-centered design in the way that Creative Reaction Lab has sort of, you know, talked about it and their philosophy and approach. And I see a lot of there's liberatory design. There's so many models and methods that folks have kind of began to share, and oftentimes I feel like, you know, design justice isn't saying this is the only way, which is also why, you know, I feel really at home in this network and in this community, because there's a lot of sharing of all of these different models and methods and ways of practicing towards goals that maybe, you know, stop at different points, right? When people talk about what's the difference between equality versus equity, right? You get that Robert Wood Johnson graphic of the bicycles that are uniquely, you know, fitted for people's unique needs, in equity, which is different than equality of everyone getting the same thing. And I think that's the same thing with design justice is talking about justice and higher levels of liberation, right? And I think it's just that, these models focus on different aspects of practice, and I will go to them for the unique things that I'm designing for, right? And that's kind of the beauty of it. I think one thing around, you know, I've come to feel differently about design thinking and sort of these double diamond models and these things that have roots, right? When we look into the history of design, roots in corporate capitalist sort of you know, structures. And I think urgency plays into that, like rapid prototyping and these cycles of, and the truth about equity and justice and liberation, these other practices, we have to move a lot slower to be more inclusive. And so that's the lens that I often am looking at these different models around, like, you know, why am I, you know, using these tools, or why am I being guided by certain things, and where are they coming from, and who are they meant to serve? Those are sort of the things that brings me into thinking about. But I don't know if anyone else.
I think someone said this earlier, but I forget who it was. But basically, the big difference, I think, is the justice center. And I think a big way for something to be justice centered is that it has to acknowledge and struggle with the idea of power and inequity and difference. And that doesn't always come up in a lot of these other design methods. People don't always look for what has worked historically or why things are the way that they are. I think that that's perfectly compatible with many different other ways of doing design, right? I think it's just the question of whether or not that actually happens or not. So it's about justice and it's about power. I think those are the big things. And then what comes out of that when you acknowledge that is, you know, trying to center the experiences of specific kinds of groups and see that as an asset and a way to start the design, rather than people that are kind of like an asterisk or an outlier or, you know, edge case, whatever.
So that leads me to sort of, sorry.
Can I add one?
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
I was just gonna say, I think, and maybe this is just my opinion, is that a good design process, like, is in thinking about power structures and listening to communities and listening to what's working now. And so, like, a human-centered design process, if you do it really well, you are doing a justice-centered design practice or like a participatory design practice. I think when you do a traditional design practice, traditional human-centered design process poorly, you end up with something that doesn't work super well for the community. And I think that often, if you look at like why that happened, it's because of like urgency. It's because you weren't able to reach people, and you weren't able to center like what they actually needed. So I think you'll start, once you start to dig into it, like at least in my own personal practice, I've found that they're really linked. They're all reaching for the same goal.
So I guess that brings me to two other questions. So is that why, you know, we often hear that design can unintentionally do harm because they're not really bringing in the people who the problem affects, and they're not taking the time to truly understand the problem?
%100%.
Great. So not so much a question, but an affirmative yes. All right. So then the other question then, what does it mean then to work toward creating a truly non-exploitative solution? Like, how would one get to that? In your opinions?
My goodness, it's such a good question. Because I think it depends, right, on so many factors. And I think that's the thing that we were just speaking to around, like, harm happens when you are assessing, Sasha writes about this in the book, like the benefits and the harm of engaging. And this is why I think I use this language that, you know, was kind of introduced to me from other equity spaces, just like the conditions for something to be just, like, before even engaging, like, are we asking ourselves, like, could this be harmful for this person? I think, you know, also not seeing all collaborative processes, right, as inherently equaling justice and equity, just because you are involved. And we've seen this, right, like in asking folks of color or folks who hold, you know, intersecting marginalized identities to come to the table when the table is not, like, ready for anyone to, like, or whatever happens at the table won't actually, like, lead to change. And so I think that piece around what is a process that would be, you know, I use the word reciprocity a lot, and we read Braiding Sweetgrass, so we've been going back to sort of indigenous sort of like thinking and learning and practices, and just seeing that exploitation happens when we are asking someone to give more than we could ever possibly, return or even make up for in terms of benefits and harms, right? Like, and the harm is so great. So as institutions, when we are engaging people, we can't really account and repair for all of the sort of harm that has happened sometimes. And so I don't know, though, if folks have ever thoughts around this.
If no other thoughts about that, I wonder if, I'd like to bring it back to health and healthcare a little. How do you see design justice being integrated into healthcare? And specifically, the role of nurses, physicians in sort of using the design justice principles in their work?
I have a lot of opinions about this one. So, yeah, so I'm actually working on another article right now. Data scientists, including clinicians, can use sex gender data better. But so I've been thinking a lot about the medical system generally and ways that it could improve. So I think there's a lot of different avenues for this. So I think some of it is thinking about designing the patient-centered experience. So for example, there's a lot of EHR systems now and a lot of doctor's offices that are trying to be more welcoming and inclusive, whether that's, using people's preferred names, using their correct pronouns, having interpreters available. Like there's the whole patient-facing side of things, like before they actually receive the clinical care, that I think there's a lot of opportunities, but also like a lot of active work that I think is going in the right direction. And then there's also the clinical care, whether that's the bedside interactions that people have. So it's kind of in between. That's kind of like the in between the like when they walk in the office versus while they're receiving the care. And then there's also the actual like clinical care and also clinical research side of things. And so like that's the stuff where I've been doing a lot, and then also medical tech and medical devices. I think all of those have room for improvement. And I think one of the big challenges, especially that I focus a lot in my technical research, is on chronic disease. And there's so many disproportionate health impacts and disparities in things like chronic disease. And our healthcare system really is not set up to handle that at all. So I could talk about any of those things, but I think there's basically room for it everywhere. And I think that it's kind of like, okay, well, where am I and where should I start, right? Like in your position, what can you do? And I think the big takeaway from this sex gender paper that I'm working on right now is that although it is really important to be affirming to patients, their sex gender also deeply impacts the clinical care that they receive. So it's not enough to use someone's correct pronouns. You actually have to incorporate that into the clinical care they receive, and needs to be more gender affirming healthcare in terms of understanding what people need and so that they get the right treatments.
And one thing I'll add, which Maggie, that was amazing. I think so much knowledge. You should give a whole nother talk just on that. I think like one thing that helps me think about what could involve design justice is like, what is a decision? All decisions are opportunities to design. So that could be designing a program, like making a program, even how you're interacting with a single patient in a moment is in a way to design. So I think that opens it up quite broadly for where you could think about involving these principles.
All right, so with that, I want to thank you all so much for sharing your work and your experience, your knowledge with us today. and for helping us learn more about the Design Justice Network, Design Justice principles, and of course the Philly Node. I hope other folks will help. And for those of you still on, we will link this on our website so you can check it out, share with your friends, colleagues, and on social media. And I hope you all have a good, I don't even know what today is, Wednesday. Have a good Wednesday, and thank you all for joining. Thanks again.